You're not welcome here anymore. The porch light was still on, a flicker of hope. Margaret climbed the last step. Her knees ached, but not as much as her heart. She clutched the lasagna dish close, still warm, still homemade. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the doorbell. Once, twice, footsteps. She smiled. It had been weeks. The door opened. Daniel stood there. His eyes were tired, his lips flat. Behind him, Lena, arms crossed, makeup perfect, cold. "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret said softly. Daniel didn't move. "Why are you here?" The words sliced through her like frost. She blinked. "I brought dinner. I thought maybe—" "You didn't call?" Lena interrupted. Margaret's smile faltered. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." Lena leaned forward. "We have a rule now. No surprises." Margaret looked at her son. His eyes didn't meet hers. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just miss you." Daniel's jaw tensed. "This isn't your home anymore, Mom." The dish slipped, cracked on the tile. Glass and tomato sauce spilled like a crime scene. Margaret didn't move. Lena stepped forward and handed her a towel. "You should go." "Daniel?" Margaret whispered. He shut the door. Software, but final. She stood there, in the dark, surrounded by glass, her lasagna bleeding at her feet. It hadn't always been this way. Once Daniel had clung to her leg when he was scared. Once he had whispered, "I love you more than the moon." Once he had brought home a girl with teary eyes and no one else to turn to. That girl was Lena. Margaret took her in, fed her, taught her to cook, held her when her own mother passed. Margaret had said, "You're family now." And Lena had smiled. But some smiles are weapons, and some gratitude is a lie. Margaret drove home in silence. She didn't cry, not yet. But her fingers curled tightly around the steering wheel. The clock read 9:12 p.m. The world outside blurred in streetlights and ache. She pulled into her driveway, turned off the engine, sat there, staring at her own front door, a door that had never closed on her. She whispered, "What did I do wrong?" And the house didn't answer. She cleaned the dish the next morning, every shard, piece by piece, hands steady, eyes blank. When it was done, she opened the drawer, pulled out the old journal, and wrote, "He closed the door on me, my son, the boy I raised alone. He stood next to her and forgot I ever mattered." The ink bled a little, but her hand didn't shake. She turned the page and wrote one more thing. "This isn't over." She didn't leave the house for 3 days, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't know who she was anymore. She boiled tea, didn't drink it, turned on the TV, didn't watch it. She folded the same sweater 3 times, sat in her old recliner, and stared at the wall where Daniel's kindergarten photo used to hang. It was gone. Removed quietly 1 year ago, when Lena moved in. She thought of that day, the first night Lena cried at the kitchen table. She had wrapped her arms around the girl, held her like her own. Lena had clung to her like a daughter. "Thank you," she'd whispered. "You saved me." Margaret had believed her. By the 4th day, Margaret got dressed, fully dressed, hair combed, lipstick, pearl earrings. She didn't have anywhere to be, but she needed to feel like someone again. At the grocery store, the cashier smiled at her. Margaret nodded, but didn't smile back. She grabbed a bottle of white wine she didn't need, and 2 frozen dinners she didn't want, and told herself it was okay. Loneliness is quiet, but it's heavy. That night, she called Daniel, straight to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She knew Lena would listen first. She stared at the phone in her hand and whispered, "Where are you?" Her voice cracked. That's when the tears came. Slow, reluctant, angry. She wept alone. The lasagna dish was still in the sink. On the 5th day, she found her courage. She picked up her phone, not to call Daniel, but to call James, her neighbor, her lawyer, a good man. "James," she said, "I need to know if I still own the house." A pause. Then his voice, "Let me come by." Margaret sat straighter. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't done. She was waking up. And it was time. Time to remember who she was before they tried to erase her. Time to fight, not for revenge, but for herself. For everything they thought she would just let go. For everything they stole with a smile. Margaret stood. And the old house, her house, felt warmer already. The letter came on a Tuesday. No name on the envelope. Just one word in delicate script. Mother. Her hand froze. Not because it was cold, but because that word no longer felt like hers. She opened it carefully. Inside, one page, typed, formal, detached. "We believe it is best for all parties to establish boundaries." Margaret blinked. A beat, then another. The words began to swim. She looked closer. "Please respect our decision and refrain from further contact." No signature, no warmth, not even Daniel's name. It didn't feel like a letter. It felt like an execution. She set it down. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. Tick. Tick. Nothing. She stood up and paced. Each step echoed. Margaret's chest tightened. What had Lena said? Something about peace of mind. Something about space. But peace never looked like this. She reached for the phone. Daniel's number still on speed dial. She hovered, then set it down again. Why call someone who's already gone? Gone, but alive. Her fingers itched, not with anger, but purpose. She walked to the kitchen, opened the cabinet, pulled out the shoebox. Inside, photos, letters, legal documents, all hers, all untouched. She spread them on the table, built her past back together, brick by brick. Daniel's first drawing, her deed to the house, the loan she paid off alone, receipts from every holiday dinner she cooked. All there. She whispered to herself, "If they're going to erase me, they'd better be prepared to lose everything they built on me." The silence grew louder that week, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Of thought, of planning, of strength. She wasn't a weak old woman. She was a mother, a warrior with wrinkles. And they underestimated her. Everyone does. Until they can't anymore. Margaret woke before sunrise, her bones heavy, but her mind alert. For the first time in weeks, she felt ready. She made coffee, black, strong, no sugar. Just like she used to when Daniel was little, before the world changed, before Lena came in, before silence became her son's love language. She sat at the kitchen table, stacks of folders beside her, receipts, titles, photos, letters. They thought she didn't keep records, but Margaret remembered everything. She pulled out a manila envelope, her mortgage paperwork, fully paid, by her. Long before Daniel ever had a steady paycheck. She laid it down next to a letter from the utility company. All in her name. She placed the deed on top. Daniel's name was nowhere on it. They thought kindness meant surrender. They mistook warmth for weakness. By noon, her lawyer called. "Margaret, I reviewed everything. You're protected." She nodded slowly. "But I'm not interested in just being protected," she said. "I want to be heard." A pause. Then James said, "Then we make noise." She smiled. A quiet, dangerous smile. "I'll need a printer." "And copies." "And time." He agreed, and she got to work. That afternoon she walked down to the post office, dressed in her nicest coat, hair brushed, pearls on. A woman walked past her and smiled. "You look lovely today." Margaret nodded. "Thank you." It felt like a spark, like something waking up. At the counter, she slid the envelope across. Certified mail, addressed to Daniel and Lena Whitmore. Inside, a copy of the updated will, a copy of the deed, a letter in her own hand. Not cruel, but clear. "You may have turned your back on me, but I remember everything I've done for you, everything I gave, everything I carried. I am not your burden. I am your backbone." The next day, no call, no message. But she didn't expect one. They would read it, then scramble, then spin their web. She knew Lena would twist it into something selfish. She's bitter. She's confused. She's trying to ruin us. But Margaret had facts now. Power. And something even more dangerous. Nothing left to lose. She started going out more. Walks in the morning. A book club on Thursday. She even joined a community garden, planted rosemary and sage. The other women welcomed her. They laughed, listened, shared. And for a moment, Margaret realized she wasn't just rebuilding, she was reclaiming. One morning, at the grocery store, she turned the corner into the cereal aisle, and there he was, Daniel, holding a box of granola, looking thinner, tired. He saw her. Froze. "Mum." She nodded. "Daniel?" They stood in silence. Too many words between them. None of them safe. None of them easy. Finally, he said, "I got your letter." She nodded. He shifted. "Lena's upset." Margaret smiled. "I imagine she is." Another pause. Then she turned her cart. "You were always welcome," she said over her shoulder. "You chose differently." She didn't look back, but she knew he stood there, still holding that cereal, still not knowing what to say. That night, she sat in her armchair, fireplace crackling, blanket over her knees, journal open. She wrote, "Today, I looked him in the eye, and I didn't flinch. They stole my place in their lives, but they can't touch my name, or my strength." She turned the page, wrote one word, rebuild, then underlined it, twice. Tomorrow, she would return to her garden. Tomorrow, she would speak to the church board about volunteering. Tomorrow, she would host tea for the neighborhood, because she still had a life. And it wasn't theirs to cancel. It started with a knock, not loud, not rushed, just enough to disturb the rhythm of her tea. Margaret walked slowly to the door, her bones stiff but certain. When she opened it, there stood Helen from the neighborhood council, and two others she didn't recognize. "We were hoping you'd join us for the town fundraiser," Helen said, handing her a flyer. Margaret blinked. She hadn't been asked to anything in months. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the paper. "I'd love to." They smiled, and for the first time, her name meant something outside the walls of her past. That night, she sat at her desk, the invitation in one hand, a photo of Daniel and Lena on her screen. Public profiles made things easy. Lena had posted a quote, "Cutting out toxicity isn't cruel, it's self-care." Over a picture of her and Daniel smiling in a new dining room. Her dining room. Margaret stared. Every chair, every fork, even the antique mirror. All hers. She whispered, "You don't get to smile over the bones of what I built." The fundraiser came quickly. Margaret wore navy blue, hair pulled back, eyes lined with quiet fury. She greeted people with grace, chose her words carefully, listened more than she spoke. But one moment stood out. Helen's husband pulled her aside. "You raised Daniel, didn't you?" She nodded. "Great kid. Shame how distant he seems these days." Margaret didn't reply, But inside, something shifted. Others noticed, others remembered, and not everyone believed the story Lena sold. Back home, she typed a new document. She called it History They Forgot. She listed every sacrifice, every time she stayed up through fevers, every debt she paid off to keep Daniel from drowning, every birthday she made magical. Not for guilt, but for evidence. They were rewriting her. She was writing back. 2 days later, her lawyer called again. "There's been an inquiry." Margaret stiffened. "What kind?" "Daniel's trying to access the deed." Her breath froze. "Can he?" "Number, it's locked. Your sole owner." She closed her eyes. "They're planning something." "Yes," James replied. "But so are you." She began to gather allies, people from the church, from the council, old friends who hadn't heard her side. She didn't beg for sympathy. She told the truth. And truth, when spoken plainly, is louder than any lie. One by one they listened. One by one they stood by her. Margaret realized revenge didn't always wear a scream. Sometimes it looked like resilience, like roots holding ground during a storm. Sunday morning, she attended church, sat in the second pew. Daniel walked in. With Lena. The room tensed. They hadn't been in months. Margaret didn't turn, didn't blink. The sermon was on forgiveness. Margaret took notes, not on how to forgive, but on how to watch the people who ask for it without meaning it. After the service, Daniel approached. "Mum, can we talk?" She smiled softly. "I'm listening." But Lena interrupted. "She's just trying to stir things up." Margaret turned. Her voice was velvet and steel. "I built this family. I held it together when no one else would." Lena rolled her eyes. "Don't make this dramatic." Margaret leaned closer. "This isn't drama. This is history, and I'm still alive to tell it." Daniel looked between them. He said nothing, but his silence was heavier than anything he could have said. That night, Margaret opened her journal. They came to church, to the one place they thought I'd stay quiet. They forget. It was me who taught Daniel to pray. She drew a line across the page, and beneath it wrote, "The storm is coming, but I've lived through worse." Margaret didn't sleep that night. The words from church echoed. The silence from Daniel lingered. She boiled water for tea at 2 a.m., but never drank it. Just watched the steam rise and disappear, like the warmth in her family. She wandered the house barefoot. Each creak in the floorboards felt like an old memory. A laugh in the kitchen, a Christmas morning whisper, a slammed door after teenage arguments. The hallway was quiet now, but not empty. It held echoes and ghosts. The next morning, a letter arrived. Not from Daniel, not from Lena, but from the housing board. Notice of dispute filed. Margaret's fingers went cold. She read the details 3 times. Daniel had filed a claim. He was challenging ownership, claiming verbal agreements, that she promised him the house, that he had contributed significantly. Margaret sank into the chair. She couldn't breathe. This was war, and it was signed by her son. She called James. He answered on the first ring. "I got it too," he said. She didn't speak. He continued, "It won't hold. Not with what we've got." "But he's lying," she whispered. "Yes, and he put it in writing. That's a gift, Margaret." She didn't feel victorious. She felt gutted. Betrayed didn't even touch it. The next week blurred. Legal meetings, paperwork, calls. Each time she heard Daniel's name, it felt like being cut again. Yet she kept showing up, kept dressing with purpose, kept walking into rooms where people expected her to break. And instead, she documented every call, every message, every lie. She visited the attic, pulled out old videos, birthdays, family barbecues, Daniel smiling beside her, laughing. Lena wasn't in most of them. The contrast was sharp. It stung. But it also reminded her that boy did love her once. He just forgot. She made copies of the tapes, labeled them just in case. She was no longer only protecting her property, she was protecting her truth. At the garden that weekend, she stayed late. One of the women, Ruth, noticed. "You okay?" Margaret paused, then told her everything. The letters, the lawsuit, the betrayal. When she finished, Ruth just said, "Don't let them take your peace too." It stuck with her. All night. Don't let them take your peace. She stood in front of the mirror, brushed her grey hair back, looked herself in the eyes. "I'm still here," she said aloud. "I remember who I am." Her voice cracked, but it didn't break. 2 days later, another knock. Daniel, alone. No Lena. He looked pale, eyes rimmed red. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside. He sat, fidgeted, didn't speak. Finally, "I didn't want it to get this far." She waited. He continued. "It was Lena. She pushed it. Said we had to secure our future." Margaret stared. "No one forced you to sign your name." He winced. "I know." She folded her hands. "What do you want, Daniel?" He looked up, tears in his eyes. "I want to fix it." She didn't flinch, didn't soften. "You fix things by undoing what you did, not just by feeling sorry." Silence. He nodded slowly. "I'll withdraw the claim." She nodded once. "You'll call James, not me." He stood, started to hug her. She stepped back. "Not yet." He left. The house was quiet again, but this time it wasn't lonely. It was powerful. That night she opened her journal again. He came. He apologized. "But I'm not who I was when he left. I'm stronger now. Not in spite of what they did, but because of it." She drew another line and wrote, "They tried to erase me, but I became permanent." The sun rose behind a grey sky. Clouds stretched like bruises across the horizon. Margaret watched from the porch, coffee in hand, blanket across her knees, and a stack of legal documents beside her. The claim had been withdrawn. Yes, but the damage had already soaked into the floorboards, into the walls, into her. She walked the house, one room at a time, touching old memories, noticing the things that stayed, and the ones that had been taken without asking. The crystal bowl from her mother, gone. The grandfather clock she restored after Harold passed, scratched. The painting above the mantel, still there, but crooked, like everything else in her life. She opened a closet and stared at his baby blanket, soft blue, worn edges. She held it to her face, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I did everything for you." Then folded it gently and put it back. Later that week, the lawyer called again. "Are you sure you want to proceed with the countersuit?" Margaret paused. "Yes. Let the court see every attempt they made to remove me from what I built." James sighed. "Okay, then we file on Monday." She nodded. "This isn't just about a house," she said. "It never was." The whispers in the town started to shift. Lena's story had holes, big ones. People noticed how fast she redecorated, how quickly Daniel seemed to echo her lines. But Margaret didn't defend herself. She let the truth seep into the cracks, like water finding its way through stone. One afternoon, she saw Lena at the grocery store. Lena walked right past her, eyes forward, chin high. Margaret said nothing. But the cashier, an older woman, leaned in and whispered, "She doesn't deserve the grace you still carry." Margaret smiled. It wasn't about deserving, it was about dignity, Heron, not theirs. Back home, she cleaned out Daniel's old room, box by box, each one marked and stacked. She placed them in the garage, next to the donation pile. She wasn't erasing him. She was letting go of what he'd become, a stranger, twisted by someone else's love. On Sunday, Ruth from the garden called. "There's a local journalist asking about elder rights. I told her about you." Margaret hesitated. "I'm not sure I want that attention. But your story could help people." Another long pause. Then, "Okay, let her come." The reporter arrived 2 days later. Young, sharp eyes, notepads and recorders. Margaret brewed fresh tea, sat across from her, and told the whole story. From the kindness that was mistaken for consent, to the silence that was branded as guilt, and the war that followed. The journalist asked, "What kept you going?" Margaret answered without blinking. "I remembered who I was before they told me I wasn't enough." The article went live within the week, titled, "They Wanted Her Gone, She Chose to Stay Standing." It spread fast. Comments flooded in. Support, outrage, solidarity. Even strangers mailed letters. Some included their own stories. Margaret read every single one. Some made her cry. Some made her laugh. But all of them made her feel one thing: not alone. She hosted a tea party for the women from the garden. They brought cakes, stories, light. Margaret sat at the head of the table, not just because she was the oldest, but because she had survived, and they knew it. One woman asked, "Will you ever forgive them?" Margaret stirred her tea. "I don't know, but I will outlive what they did to me." The table went silent. Then someone said, "To Margaret." They all raised their cups, and she felt it in her bones. Peace, real peace. For the first time in a long time, Margaret stood at the threshold of Daniel's room. The last box was gone, but the air still carried him. She could almost hear his teenage voice, the slammed doors, the music, the quiet confessions after nightmares. He had been her boy, before he became someone else's echo. She sat at her desk, and for the first time in weeks, she opened a blank notebook. At the top, she wrote, "What now?" and underlined it twice. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a plan, a blueprint. She started with her finances, every account, every bill, every legal document tied to the house. She reviewed them line by line, then contacted a financial advisor, a woman named Eliza, sharp, kind, younger but respectful. Eliza said, "You've got plenty of security, but you also have options." Margaret leaned in. "Tell me what I've never considered." Over the next few weeks, Margaret met with specialists, elder law experts, therapists, women's groups. She wasn't just patching wounds, she was reconstructing. And every time she left a meeting, she walked taller, more certain, less apologetic. One afternoon, Daniel came again, this time without warning. He held a small box. "Just a few things I found from before." He looked ashamed. Margaret took the box, didn't open it. Not yet. Daniel sat. "I read the article," he said. I didn't know how others saw me." She tilted her head. "And now that you do, I feel sick." She didn't respond. Silence worked better. He tried again. "I miss when things were easy between us." "They were never easy," she corrected. "They were earned." He swallowed hard. "I want to be better." Margaret stood. "I want that too, but wanting and doing are oceans apart." He nodded. Tears welled in his eyes, but she didn't offer comfort. This was his discomfort to carry. After he left, she opened the box. Inside were photos, a locket, a drawing from kindergarten, a note written by a 6-year-old hand. I love you, Mommy Margaret. She held it to her chest and let the tears fall. But they weren't grief, they were release. At her next meeting with Eliza, Margaret said, I want to draft a new will. Eliza nodded. What are you thinking? Margaret smiled. I'm thinking legacy, but not the way they expect. She began researching non-profits, causes close to her heart, shelters, scholarships for young women, support for elderly rights. She planned to leave most of her estate to those who'd never expect it and would never exploit it. She drafted letters to Daniel, to Lena. She didn't sign them with bitterness. She signed them with closure. I gave you love, one letter read. But you tried to turn it into currency. I won't let that be the final story. She framed the drawing from the box, placed it above her desk, a reminder that even if he forgot who she never did, and she never would. The garden bloomed stronger that year. Sunflowers, peonies, lavender. People passed and waved, and Margaret waved back. She was no longer the woman they whispered about. She was the one they learned from. She wrote in her notebook again. At the top of a fresh page, peace isn't quiet. It's choosing not to shout. And beneath that, Margaret walked the edge of her garden. The morning air was sharp. It smelled like soil and endings. She kneeled to prune a rosebush. Its thorns caught her glove. She didn't flinch. Pain wasn't new. It simply reminded her she was still here, still fighting, still herself. Inside, the phone rang. It was the nursing home, a volunteer coordinator she'd spoken with last spring. Still interested in mentoring? Margaret's lips curled slightly. I am. She spent her Wednesdays teaching women how to advocate for themselves. Older women, like her. Tired, kind, faded from the world's view, but still radiant underneath the grief. They listened, they learned, and she told them, if they underestimate you, that's your greatest weapon. Lena called, the first time in months. It was clipped. Daniel's sick. He's asking for you. Margaret's stomach dropped. She asked nothing, only said, I'll come tomorrow. Lena didn't even say goodbye. At the hospital, Margaret walked in with a scarf wrapped tight. Her hair had greyed more in recent months, but her eyes had never been clearer. Daniel looked pale, thin, small, like the boy who used to climb into bed with her after nightmares. He looked up. Mum. She sat beside him, waited. I'm sorry, he whispered. I don't know what I was thinking. She said nothing, just placed her hand on his. Not forgiveness, not yet, but presence, and he wept. Lena stood by the window, watching, her jaw tight. Later, she followed Margaret to the hallway. Are you going to change your will? Margaret turned slowly. No. You're really going to give it all away? Yes. To strangers? To survivors? Lena's eyes darkened. You're making a mistake. Margaret stepped closer. No, dear. I made the mistake when I let you in. That night, Margaret wrote a letter to herself. Dear Margaret, you survived heartbreak without becoming hard. You walked through betrayal without losing your balance. You are not what they tried to reduce you to. You are not what they failed to protect. You are every part of the garden that blooms again. Let the story end how you decide. Love me. She placed the letter on her nightstand and slept better than she had in years. The air smelled like rain, not because it had started, but because something was about to break. Margaret stood at the foot of her staircase, clutching a thick folder to her chest. Inside, bank statements, legal letters, photographs, deeds. Years of proof of ownership, proof of sacrifice, proof that she had mattered. The doorbell rang. 3 short chimes. She didn't move at first, then slowly walked to the door. It wasn't Lena this time. It wasn't Daniel either. It was a man in a pressed suit. Mrs. Caldwell? Yes? I'm here to speak on behalf of your son and daughter-in-law. May I come in? She didn't step aside. I prefer we speak right here. He cleared his throat. They've asked me to offer mediation. A compromise. She raised a brow. What's the price of my silence now? He blinked. They regret how things have unfolded. No, they regret being seen for who they are. He tried to smile. They've suggested a new will, one that honors both sides. Margaret leaned closer. I've written my final story, and in it, I am not erased. She closed the door before he could answer. That night, she called Eliza. I want to file the final paperwork. No more drafts. Are you sure, Margaret? Yes. It's time they understood I'm not holding my breath for their redemption. The next day, she mailed letters. One to the shelter, one to the scholarship fund, one to the community centre she helped open in '89. Each contained a certified confirmation. They were now her heirs. The joy in their responses made her cry, the kind of crying that cleanses, not the kind that breaks you. Lena sent flowers, white roses, no card. She left them on the porch. Margaret didn't bring them in. She watched them wilt over the next 4 days, and then threw them in the compost. They'd serve the garden more than they ever served her. At church, people began sitting next to her again. They asked about her garden, her mentoring. They didn't ask about Daniel. They didn't need to. She had reclaimed her name, without shouting, without revenge, just with truth, and a backbone made of oak. One evening, Daniel knocked. No warning. She opened the door. He looked tired. I know you've changed it, he said. She waited. I don't want money. I want you to know I'm trying. She looked at him. You let her turn me into a burden. I know. And still, I never stopped being your mother. He looked down. I don't deserve anything. No, she said. But you can still choose who you become next. He left without another word. She sat down that night and lit a candle. Not for him, for her. For every version of herself she had to kill to stay kind, to stay soft, to survive. She closed her eyes and whispered, This house is mine. My life is mine. My name is still Margaret. And for the first time since Lena walked into her family, she felt safe. Not because they were gone, but because she no longer needed their permission to feel whole. Margaret stood in front of the mirror. She didn't fix her hair. She didn't adjust her sweater. She just stared. Grey strands framed her face like silver crown threads. Her eyes didn't shimmer like they used to. They burned. With knowing. With memory. With the weight of what she'd endured. And the strength of having survived it. The phone rang. This time it was the local newspaper. A journalist had read about the donations. Would you be willing to speak on the record? Margaret hesitated, not out of fear, out of calculation. Only if it helps someone feel less alone, she said. The piece ran 2 weeks later. Elder betrayal and quiet triumph, one woman's legacy. Margaret's words were printed exactly as she gave them. No edits, no filters. I gave everything to love. When love turned its back, I gave what was left to the world. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in. Messages. Women came to her porch just to hug her. Not because she was famous, but because she had named their pain. Daniel came by again. He held the article. It's powerful, he said. She nodded. I didn't name you. I know, but I recognized myself anyway. He looked up. Do you hate me? She was quiet a long time. Number. But I don't need you anymore. That's different. He nodded, and for the first time, he looked like a man instead of a shadow. Lena never returned. No more flowers, no calls, no letters. Margaret found peace in her absence, a silence that didn't ache, just space, breathable, calm. At the end of summer, Margaret hosted a small dinner, just 5 women, all over 60, all with stories of being silenced, softened, erased. They laughed. They cried. They made toasts with wine and with stories. And when the sun went down, they sat in candlelight and passed around a notebook. Each wrote a sentence. One wrote, "I am not disposable." Another, "I am not here to die quietly." Margaret wrote last, "They took my son, but they couldn't take me." And then she closed the book and smiled. Her house wasn't full, but it was no longer empty. It was hers. Every room, every step, every silence spoke her name now, Margaret. A name they tried to forget, but one the world would now remember. Margaret stood in front of the mirror. She didn't fix her hair. She didn't adjust her sweater. She just stared. Grey strands framed her face like silver crown threads. Her eyes didn't shimmer like they used to. They burned. With knowing. With memory. With the weight of what she'd endured. And the strength of having survived it. The phone rang. This time it was the local newspaper. A journalist had read about the donations. "Would you be willing to speak on the record?" Margaret hesitated. Not out of fear, out of calculation. "Only if it helps someone feel less alone," she said. The piece ran 2 weeks later. Elder betrayal and quiet triumph, one woman's legacy. Margaret's words were printed exactly as she gave them. No edits, no filters. "I gave everything to love. When love turned its back, I gave what was left to the world." The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in. Messages. Women came to her porch just to hug her, not because she was famous, but because she had named their pain. Some brought flowers, others brought food. One brought her teenage daughter and whispered, she needed to meet someone strong. Daniel came by again. He held the article. "It's powerful," he said. She nodded. "I didn't name you." "I know, but I recognize myself anyway." He looked up. "Do you hate me?" She was quiet a long time. "Number, but I don't need you anymore. That's different." He nodded, and for the first time he looked like a man instead of a shadow. Then he added, "I miss you, Mum." Margaret smiled faintly. "I still live here. I'm just no longer waiting." Lena never returned. No more flowers, no calls, no letters. Margaret found peace in her absence. A silence that didn't ache. Just space. Breathable. Calm. Even her name stopped appearing in the mailbox. No more legal threats. No cold emails. Just a fading memory in the air. At the end of summer, Margaret hosted a small dinner. Just 5 women. All over 60. All with stories of being silenced, softened, erased. They laughed. They cried. They made toasts with wine and with stories. One spoke of her daughter who stopped calling after she retired. Another of a brother who stole her pension. The third had been quietly removed from the family will by her husband's children. They weren't strangers anymore. They were sisters in scars. And when the sun went down, they sat in candlelight and passed around a notebook. Each wrote a sentence. One wrote, "I am not disposable." Another, "I am not here to die quietly." Margaret wrote last. "They took my son, but they couldn't take me." She paused, then added, "And what's mine now belongs to the women the world forgot." And then she closed the book and smiled. Her house wasn't full, but it was no longer empty. It was hers. Every room, every step, every silence spoke her name now, Margaret, a name they tried to forget, but one the world would now remember, because she dared to remember herself first. The air was still. Margaret sat by the fireplace, a knitted shawl around her shoulders. The flames crackled softly, casting gold on the lined pages in her lap. It was the same notebook from the dinner, the one filled with words from women like her, the ones who had been stepped over, forgotten, silenced. She flipped to the last page. Blank. She picked up her pen and paused. What do I write now? When the anger settles, when the grief quiets. What comes next? Outside, a knock on the window. Margaret looked up. Eliza. Her lawyer. Friend now, more than anything. She opened the door. Eliza held an envelope. Heavy, formal, and Margaret knew. She didn't need to ask. It's finalized? Eliza nodded. Margaret took the envelope and held it to her chest. Thank you. Number, thank you. You've helped more women than you know. They hugged. No words, just warmth. Margaret sat at her kitchen table. She opened the envelope. The new deed, the final will, the trusts. Everything sealed, delivered, protected. She smiled. Mine, she whispered. Finally mine. Not for the family who abandoned her, but for the ones who still needed her, who needed to know they weren't crazy, or ungrateful, or broken, just alone. Until someone spoke. And now, Margaret had spoken. That afternoon, she visited the library. She walked past the fiction, the history, the cookbooks, to a small display near the entrance, a new section. Community Voices. There it was. Her name, Margaret Caldwell. With a quote beneath, I am not finished. I am finally beginning. The essay had been published, bound, placed among others. Dozens. Hundreds soon, she hoped. An older man approached. Well, I'll be. That's you. Margaret chuckled. Only on paper. He smiled. My wife read it. Twice. Said it made her feel seen. Margaret touched his arm gently. Tell her she's not alone. I think she knows that now. Walking home, Margaret passed the park. She stopped. The swing set creaked in the wind. 2 kids ran past, laughing. She sat on a bench and watched. One of the children tripped, cried. The other helped him up. No hesitation, no questions, just instinct. Margaret closed her eyes, remembered Daniel at that age, the scraped knees, the wild giggles, the whispered secrets before bedtime. Where had it all gone? She didn't cry, not this time. Just let the ache pass through her like weather, temporary, necessary. That night, she added one more line to the notebook. I spoke, and the world listened. Now let others speak too. She closed it gently and placed it on her nightstand, next to the candle, next to the framed photo of her garden, not of her family, not anymore, because her story no longer needed them to be complete. The morning air was sharp, colder than usual. Margaret wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped onto the porch. She stood there, still, watching the leaves tumble across the yard. They reminded her of thoughts, scattered, unstoppable, some returning, some drifting far. The mailbox creaked when she opened it. Just one letter, from Daniel. She stared at it, not moving, as if opening it would open everything. The pain, the hope, the hurt. She tore it slowly. Inside, 2 things, a handwritten note and a photograph. The photo was old, Margaret and Daniel. At the beach, he was 6. She looked so young. Sunlight in their hair, joy on their faces, the kind you don't fake. Her hand trembled as she read the note. I found this. I remembered that day. You built a castle with me, and I tore it down without seeing what it meant. I'm sorry, Mum, for everything. I don't expect anything in return, I just wanted you to know. I remember who you were and who you still are. Daniel. She sat down. The wind picked up. She let the photo rest on her lap, then leaned back and closed her eyes. For a moment, she let herself believe it, that maybe he meant it, that maybe it wasn't too late. Not for repair, but for understanding. And that was enough. She didn't need his return. She needed the truth acknowledged. And now it was. That evening, Margaret returned to her garden. Weeds had started crawling in again. She didn't mind. Weeds were honest. They showed up without pretending. She knelt slowly, fingers brushing the soil. She started pulling one by one, letting the dirt run through her hands. Each tug felt like a memory, released, forgiven. Across the yard, a car parked. She didn't look up at first, not until she heard the door shut. Footsteps, software tentative. "Mum?" She turned. Daniel stood there. No suitcase, no flowers, just him. Alone. Real. She stood, wiped her hands on her apron, looked him in the eyes. "You didn't need to come. I know, but I wanted to." They stood in silence. Then she stepped aside. "Come in, but leave your past at the gate." He nodded and followed her. Not as a son, but as a man finally ready to see her. The kettle whistled. Margaret poured the water carefully. Chamomile. The scent calmed her. Her hands, though still steady, shook slightly as she reached for the sugar. Old habit. Daniel always took his with too much sugar. He used to giggle when she told him so. She placed 2 cups on the tray. Even though he was already gone, he had left after just an hour, said he needed to think, to process. She understood. Growth takes time and distance. But that hour had felt like a breath after drowning, brief and life-saving. She sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty, not anymore. There was something new in the air, not forgiveness, not even hope, something else, recognition, and that was enough, for now. Margaret opened her notebook again. The one she thought she'd finished. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Today he saw me, truly saw me. Not as his mother, not as his burden, as a woman, a person. That's all I ever needed." She paused, then underlined one word, needed, past tense. She didn't need it anymore. She'd found something better, herself. Later that week, she visited a shelter, not to donate, but to ask questions. "How many women do you house? What's the waiting list? Do you take volunteers?" The director blinked at her, surprised, but grateful. They gave her a tour, showed her the kitchen, the bunk rooms, the tiny courtyard with one struggling rosebush. She smiled at it. Resilient little thing. They smiled back. "Like you." Margaret signed up for Thursdays. She helped with meal prep, sorting donations. She read aloud to women who couldn't sleep. Stories about strength, healing, not fairy tales, real tales, theirs. One night, a woman named Connie sat beside her, mid-40s, eyes like someone who had forgotten how to blink. "Why are you here?" Connie asked. Margaret stirred her tea. "Because someone tried to make me disappear, and I refused." Connie looked down. "I think I disappeared a long time ago." Margaret reached for her hand. "Then let's find you again." They sat like that a long time, saying nothing, feeling everything. Margaret started a small group, wrote letters, organized quiet meetings. One of the women drew a mural on the wall. It showed an old woman standing tall, hair wild with grey, eyes fierce. Behind her, shadows faded. In front of her, light bloomed. Margaret stood in front of it, recognized herself. Finally. "Did you mean this to be me?" she asked. The artist nodded. No one else could be. The shelter renamed their small reading room the Margaret Room. She cried, quietly, proudly, because this time her name was placed in a home, and no one could take it from her. Not again. Margaret woke to rain, tapping softly against the window. It had rained the night Daniel left for college. It had rained the day he married Lena. And now, it rained on the morning she felt a shift. A quiet whisper inside her. Something is ending. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting the thought settle. She made her tea slower that morning, her movements careful, deliberate, like preparing for a guest that wouldn't come. She didn't know what she was waiting for, only that she was. The mailbox was empty. Again, no letter, no call. Daniel hadn't followed up, hadn't returned since the visit. Margaret didn't cry, didn't even feel surprised, but it still ached, deep, right behind the ribs, like memory lodged between breath and bone. She walked back inside, closed the door, locked it, then unlocked it again. In the afternoon, she took out a small chest from the closet. It was cedar, old. Inside, a stack of letters, ones she never sent. To Daniel, to Lena, to herself. Words she was too afraid to share, or too proud to release. She opened one, read her own handwriting. You'll never know how many nights I sat in this kitchen staring at your empty chair. Another. You used to come home for my stew. Now you come for nothing. And one more. I am not angry. I am erased. That's worse. She burned them, one by one. Not out of bitterness, but for release. Some things needed to vanish to make room for breath. The ashes curled in the sink. Software almost beautiful. That evening, she received a knock. Not Daniel. It was Grace, the neighbor, young, newly divorced, carrying a pie and eyes that wanted to talk. Margaret let her in. They sat together, a strange pairing, but somehow just right. Grace shared her own hurt, her own ache, the betrayal, the loneliness. Margaret listened, nodded, offered warmth, but didn't try to fix it. That wasn't her job. Just being there was enough. Sometimes, that was everything. As the pie cooled, Grace asked, "Do you ever feel like people only come to take?" Margaret looked out the window, into the dark. I used to. And now? Now I only open the door when I feel like giving. Grace smiled. Guess I came at the right time. They laughed softly, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't think of what she'd lost, but what she still had, and what she could become. Not a mother abandoned, not a woman broken, but someone new, rebuilt, by fire and grace. Margaret woke before sunrise the next morning. The house was silent, but it wasn't lonely. She padded softly into the new study. Margaret's room. The name still felt strange, and right. She poured a cup of tea, the kind Daniel once said tasted like leaves. She sipped it anyway. She opened a notebook. And she wrote more than she had in years. Each page poured out like a confession, like a storm had passed and left something cleaner behind. She wrote about Lena, how the change wasn't sudden. It had crept in, through tone, through silence, through how Daniel started asking less about her day and more about what she had, what she owned, the house, the savings, the legacy. She wrote about Daniel too, the boy who once clung to her skirt, who slept on her shoulder during storms. She didn't write with anger. She wrote with clarity, with ache. She let the words settle on the page like dust shaken loose from the rafters. The doorbell rang. It startled her. She wiped her eyes, pressed her palms flat to the table. She walked to the door, opened it slowly. It wasn't Daniel. not Lena. It was a woman in a pale blue jacket, smiling nervously. "I'm from the local women's shelter," she said. "We got your letter. We'd love to meet." Margaret blinked. Her voice caught in her throat, then came out steady. "Come in." They talked for hours, plans, resources, workshops. Margaret shared her story. Not all of it, just the parts that mattered, the parts that would help someone else feel less invisible, less unwanted. She wasn't trying to be brave. She was just done being afraid. Months passed. The study became a command center, a hub, a sanctuary. Margaret taught a writing group every Thursday. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, her voice didn't shake anymore. One evening, while packing donation bags, her phone buzzed. Daniel. Her breath caught. She stared at the screen, then answered. "Hi, Mum." Silence. Then, I saw the newspaper article. About you. About the shelter. She waited. He said, "I didn't know you were doing all that." Her response was soft. "You never asked." They spoke for 4 minutes, not about the past, not yet, but about now. That was enough. For now. She didn't need him to understand everything. She just needed to not disappear, and she hadn't. She had become more visible than ever, to herself. And in the end, that was the victory, the kind that didn't need applause, just peace.